Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long.
Welcome back to The Solid Verbal, boys and girls. My name is Ty Hildebrand, that fine gentleman over there. As always, the esteemed, the illustrious, the iconic Dan Rubenstein, sir!
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm pretty good. I have nothing pithy or timely or insightful. I mean, some might argue that's very rare anyhow. But to add at the top with my usual "How are you?" response, I'm okay. Ty, I'm okay.
I am as well. It's great to be here with you.
Sorry I didn't give you more meat on the bone to chew on.
It's okay. We're recording. It's the first day of March.
Yeah.
2023. We've got our Patreon Verballerhood, some of which is watching us live, but all of whom can get early access to this episode just going out to verballers.com if you are ever so inclined. Not only access to some of our stuff a little bit early, but bonus content, get access to games, to the Discord. We have been in relative quiet here, relative silence, let's say, for the last couple weeks as we kind of decompress from the season, but I want everybody to know that you and I are hard at work in the lab. More to come. We're very excited about the off season and certainly the season that will hit us in the face a little bit later on this year.
I saw that Bryce Young is officially, did you see his official height?
5'10" and 1/2. Yeah.
5'10" and a half. The last time you were measured, you came in at?
Not 5'10" and a half.
Not 5'10" and a half?
No.
Are you tipping it at 5'9"?
I'm 5'9", exactly 5'9". Yeah.
Is that official? Is that doctor's office official? Physical official? Okay. I had for a long time thought this is the opposite because I think Bryce Young was hoping for a six in front of that box and didn't get it. For a long time, for whatever reason, I was under the impression that I was 6'0" nothing. The old like Rudy 5'0" nothing, 100
nothing.
I was under the impression that I was 6'0" nothing, and I got a physical in New York, I don't know, probably like 4 or 5 years now. And I've had a physical since, and it was confirmed. I'm 6'1" and like a hair above. Like wow. Do you understand when you're 6 feet tall? It's like, okay, cool. I'm 6 feet tall. That's my impression. Like, that's nice. I'm 6 feet tall. Not everybody's 6 feet tall. That's a nice feather to have. But then when they tell you you're 6'1", you're like, ooh, everybody down there, you better watch out.
Listen,
there's something about that 6 and something. Woo!
You've met my short Italian family. I never had a chance at 6 foot,
I'm
a bit envious. I'm a bit envious. Alas, we have a college football show to do.
We do.
So look,
we do.
We did an episode a few days ago with our friend Brett McMurphy of the Action Network. And Brett's been breaking a bunch of the news, not just on conference realignment, but most recently on media rights, on potential realignment. You know the tone in his voice if you listen to that episode. It was posted in every corner of the internet where college football news tends to end up. That's where our episode with Brett ended up. The tone in his voice was very much one of, as I said at the end of the episode, it had an air of inevitability to it.
Yeah.
Not just, will there be further realignment? More a sense of when there is further realignment. That the Pac-12 media rights are kind of going sideways. Obviously, we've got conversations going on in the ACC, Florida State, Clemson reportedly, quote unquote reportedly, not feeling too satisfied with their deal in the ACC. Notre Dame is just sort of hanging out, maybe waiting for something to tip one way or the other. We do live in a college football universe now with a lot of uncertainty. And so kind of on the heels of what we did this past episode with Brett, you and I are going to go through and we're going to walk something that we're calling the Oregon Trail.
Of course.
That is actually from the original 1985 game there. I found it. Thank you very much. We're going to walk the Oregon Trail, and we're going to talk through media rights. We're going to talk through potential realignment. We're going to talk through scenarios that I think one would encounter if you were walking this harrowing?
Yeah, I think that's right.
College football trail over the next couple of years, Dan.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating if this, then that, if X, then Y, maybe Z, but who's to say about L? Look, the idea of realignment, the idea of media rights less so, but realignment, it's money, it's exposure, and it's status. And I think those items cross over each other. But as we talk about the Pac-12 and their search for a media rights partner, as we look at whatever the future is, and it's like 12 years out now as the contract stands right now with ACC and ESPN, as we talk about, the Big 12 recently signing its new deal and adding new members for this season, a lot of it is now going to come down to, look, these teams coming from minor conferences, or G5 conferences, and BYU as an independent to the Big 12, they're going to be making more money. They now have the status, in the case of Cincinnati, once again, as being a power conference team, right? There is that status and money. And of course, their media rights deal, they're going to be on network TV much more often. They're going to be on big cable much more often, big streaming much more often. And the reverberations of all of these things throughout the sport it's ongoing. And so what we're going to do is look at, okay, so if this happens, what does that mean what does the sport look like when this happens, if this happens? And then if this happens, does that mean that happens? And how long before this happens? And what does that mean if we find ourselves with an ACC with that, or a Big Ten with this, or an SEC with that, or a Clemson with this, or an Arizona State with that? And so what we're trying to do is basically hit like 245 in this show, be a not a great contact hitter, but if we drill a couple that get over the fence, that in 7 years, I can say, look, things have gotten crazy, but Ty predicted this way back in 2023. Right. So we want to be on the record and hit 2 of 10, 4 of 10, 3 of 10. And then we can say down the line, like, we told you this would happen to Syracuse. Somebody should have listened.
Let's start with our first scenario, Dan, our first waypoint here as we walk this.
Okay.
Very strange version of the Oregon Trail. They've had a couple versions. First off, did you play the Oregon Trail when you were younger? Of course
I did. I consider myself to be a bit of a marksman with the single pixel that I would shoot out at those bison. Yeah.
Yeah. And, we will get to the scenario where you shoot too much buffalo, bison.
You can't bring enough meat back to the wagon.
You can't bring the meat back to the wagon. There is a tie-in here, I think, with college football with where we're headed. But
sure.
One of the greatest games of all time, my hunch is that folks of a certain age listening to this podcast are intimately familiar with the other Oregon Trail. This is, of course, a different spin on it.
It's weird to learn about dysentery as a third grader, Ty.
It was.
You're like, what did poor baby Johnny die of?
Especially when we didn't have Google back then that we could rely on to give us the answer.
Yeah,
asking your parents about dysentery.
Just
not
looking
a great
up
idea.
DYS in the Encyclopedia Britannica that's at school. DYS. Okay.
So look, we're going to start with, I think, where we ended on the last episode with Brett McMurphy. The ongoing Pac-12 media rights discussion. It is consequential, to put it simply, depending on the result of those negotiations, the partners that George Clavicle, lovingly on this show, is able to line up behind the inventory that the Pac-12 has to offer. That's, I think, going to determine a lot, both in the short and medium terms. If you believe Brett seems to think that regardless, Oregon and Washington are gone.
Yeah.
They're gone. They're waiting for that Big Ten invite. He thinks before long they're going to get it. So from at least that perspective, they're not incentivized to sign any kind of long-term agreement. But in the short term, a 4 or 5 year deal, if you can get something that makes sense, suddenly you've got a glide path of sorts into the playoff conversation. You don't have to redo everything. You don't have to worry about airline miles and time zones and that sort of thing. So it would make sense on a few levels, but maybe not on others. If you're Oregon, Dan, I know you're an Oregon alum.
Mm-hmm.
What are you looking for from this next media rights deal that would keep you in the Pac-12 as opposed to bolting for greener pastures?
At this point, nothing. At this point, the reality is that Oregon and Washington, and who knows about the Bay Area schools, Stanford and Cal, are likely gone. Look, you want the most positive spin that I could make, or the most positive scenario would be an unbelievable deal from ESPN, because that is the status element, that is the exposure element. And if it's an unbelievable deal in this made-up universe in which I'm living, there's cash, right? There's money. Now, Oregon's not necessarily cash poor, obviously. Everybody knows that. But the positive spin is if there's a great deal from ESPN and maybe some sort of deal to stream every other week's biggest game on Amazon or the second biggest game every week on Amazon or Apple or whatever, then you're dipping toes in different ways of marketing these schools. That like Amazon is this behemoth and Apple's this behemoth. That Apple has this marketing power via, every phone and tablet that everybody, or half of the people, I don't know what the market share is right now, but hundreds of millions of people around the world, or billions of people, whatever the number is, own Apple infrastructure, and that they can be marketed to them. Pac-12 football. What somebody in, Minsk wants to do with, Oregon State at the end of the year, I don't know. But there is something fun and kind of West Coasty about partnering with a major streaming partner in addition to ESPN. And I don't, you can get creative with it too, right? ESPN or Disney now owns all sorts of 20th Century Fox properties, which is why you can watch The Simpsons on Disney Plus. And so yes, they could put it on FX, they could put it on Hulu, like you could spread it around and use the idea of a big football game somewhere to promote other properties. It feels very creative and very Hollywood and West Coast. But to me, as an Oregon fan, as a West Coast football fan, the only true winner is getting a good deal from ESPN, because ESPN right now, maybe a little bit less so because of Fox and the media rights and the conference rights that they've gobbled up within the Big 12 and the Big 10. ESPN still very much is college football. And so you want to be in that conversation, just like Brett talked about. So that's the big winner. And I don't have a specific number in mind. I don't know if 23, 28, 34, 19. I don't know what that millions of dollars number is, but it's going to fall well short of even a reduced, unequal share of Big Ten revenue for Oregon and Washington. So in the short term, I'd like to see something competitive, and I'd like it to require a lot of ESPN. But the problem is, Ty, is the deeper you get in with ESPN in this deal means the more leverage ESPN is going to have, which means every single huge Pac-10 game, let's call it the Pac-10, until we know otherwise, is going to be at 10 p.m. Eastern and 10:30 p.m. Eastern, because that's what ESPN wants. That is the actual allure of all of these West Coast schools, is the ability to play in that fourth window without competition. Or without a lot of competition. Now, you're going to have USC and UCLA games, and whatever happens, with the Big 12, now that they've moved more westward. So you'll have that as competition, but you're not going to have the SEC and, all of the Big 10 and huge ACC games and huge Big 12 games as competition, as Fox angles to move more of that to the noon window, those huge games. So that's the drawback, is that a lot of us that love West Coast football that aren't on the West Coast are going to be putting in hours. That's all.
Yeah. Well, and look, we talked about this a little bit with Brett, but when the Pac-12 hired George Kliavkoff, perhaps for 5 sets of clothes, I don't know what the terms of that arrangement were, but we'll keep it on theme here. He was dealt a pretty wicked hand. The Pac-12 does not have a whole lot of negotiating power right now, and they are going to come up against, I think, the very conflict that you were describing. In a perfect world, ESPN would come to the Pac-12 with a ton of money, with attractive windows, maybe not 10:30 windows, but they'll put them on in prime time. They'll find a way to get them that prominence that they've craved for a generation now and haven't really been able to harness, and everything will be great. The problem now for George Clavicle is he can really have one or the other. If he wants to be on ESPN, perhaps he can find a way to work out a deal, but it doesn't sound like ESPN's willing to pay top dollar.
Right.
If he wants to go after the top dollar at least that he can fetch for the properties, maybe that's something like an Apple. Maybe that's something like an Ion. I doubt it, but maybe it's something like an Apple. But then suddenly your exposure is drastically reduced because you're on a streamer. You're on a streaming platform as opposed to network TV. Some of your games are still probably nationally broadcast. That's right. I would imagine that has to be the cornerstone of any of these agreements. But for the bulk of the games that are on a different streaming platform, suddenly exposure is a problem. I don't see them getting the best of both worlds, and I think therein lies the danger. That's when we start talking about Oregon and Washington, looking bigger picture at this thing, I don't think any deal is going to be perfect. And it sounds, based on Brett's reporting, some of the people he's talked to would seem to indicate that they're just sort of waiting for the terms of this deal before they decide, is this something we want to commit to?
They want to be presented with the details. Everybody wants to be presented with the details before making a decision. Can I take it into the other direction, unless you have more to add?
No, please.
What do you think of, and whether it's 2024, 2026, 2028 or 9 or 2030, when you'll be well into your 60s, if I recall correctly.
Thank you.
You won't be in your 60s. Let me clarify. What do you make of a Big Ten with USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington? What immediately grabs you about that reality?
What immediately grabs me?
Yes.
I mean, it certainly turns Lincoln, Nebraska into an interesting stopover.
Sure.
A bus depot of the Big Ten of sorts.
On the Oregon Trail, right? Along the way, it's the fur trader of the new look Big Ten. Yeah.
That's right. We're starting in Independence, Missouri, and working our way out to the beautiful Willamette Valley.
Willamette. Get it right.
Willamette, did I say it wrong?
It's Willamette, yeah.
Willamette, excuse me.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the first thing I think of is that the Big Ten has a West Coast division of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
Those schools are outside of Oregon and Washington. It's not like Oregon and Washington are that close to UCLA and USC. It's still like a 2.5 hour plane ride.
Yep.
So even in that world, for those West Coast schools, you're still putting on a lot of airline miles. But outside the obvious, what are you thinking?
You add USC, to a lesser extent UCLA, and then two programs that have reached the playoff in Oregon and Washington. What you do to the top of the Big Ten, and what the top of the Big Ten looks like as it presumably is going divisionless, or it will change the structure, right? When you add that many teams over a course of a year or 7 years, whatever. You are infusing the top of the conference, an already top-heavy conference, with a lot. Now, this is provided that Washington holds on to Kalen DeBoer, which, by the way, adding Washington is making the Washington job that much more attractive to a top flight coach like Kalen DeBoer, and they were able to keep Ryan Grubb, the offensive coordinator, this year by giving him a raise, right? So that makes the Washington job and the Oregon job. But the Oregon job, I mean, they've made national championships, Heisman. They've been ahead of Washington for some time now. It makes the Washington job a lot more attractive to somebody there, or somebody potentially who would want to go there. And then the matchups you get, and all due respect to what I think we and maybe most people perceive to be the bottom of the Big Ten, you're likely going to get crazy home schedules. If you're a season ticket holder in the Big Ten, if you're a Wisconsin season ticket holder, and it's just like Penn State, Michigan, Oregon, USC, like it changes what phrase do we use? Bangers only, right?
No.
It's going to be harder to water down. It's going to be harder to have the conversations that we had about the Big Ten West, when the Big Ten West doesn't exist, when we're saying like, okay, here's what a 1-6 Northwestern could do to still win the division. And those conversations are done.
Yeah.
Those types of conversations are absolutely done when we already have a conference with Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State at the top. Right? And then we have Wisconsin and Michigan State in here making noise. Iowa's making noise here and there. But then you add, and UCLA hasn't been amazing, but they've been flirting with top 12, top 15 rankings these past couple of years, and have had good offenses with a big name coach. You understand why these networks want to be involved in the Big Ten, CBS, NBC, whatever. And so, yeah, it turns them into a bangers-only conference in the way that the SEC is going to be turned into as well, with Texas and Oklahoma, where you're just like, man, there is no relief in sight.
Yeah, and look, I think there's a world in which Cal and Stanford could potentially be part of a Big Ten thing.
Definitely, but that's not a bangers-only element.
That's not bangers only. No, that's adding a Northwestern, a Vanderbilt, but. I think you're right. I think it makes the conference as a whole. You're adding 4 really good teams.
Yeah.
At a minimum. And that does make scheduling interesting. So why don't we say this?
Mm-hmm.
That is the sound in Oregon Trail when something dies.
Mm-hmm.
For the purposes of our conversation, the Pac-12 is now dead.
Yeah. By the way, one other thing,
Dunzo.
Ty, if I can add, Oregon and Washington much more prepared weather-wise for the Big Ten than the LA schools.
Very true.
Yeah, that's all.
Very, very, very true. It seems as if things are going in this direction, and I'm not happy about that.
Yeah.
But it certainly seems as if the Pac-12 is in a no-win situation. If, in fact, Oregon and Washington, and maybe some others, I don't know, decide they're bailing, they're going over to the Big Ten, provided the Big Ten can get its commissioner situation squared away.
Right.
Provided there is an invite. We don't know that for sure. Of course, this is a big show of speculation right now. This also means that the remaining schools in the Pac-12 are looking for an off-ramp as well.
Right.
Some of them are looking for a new home. I think the obvious statement, and we've heard this before, this has also been speculated time and again, the corner schools, so-called corner schools. So we're talking Arizona State, talking, I guess what, Colorado and Utah.
Yeah.
These schools then would be ripe to head on over to the Big 12 because the Big 12 has been very aggressive. The Big 12 has obviously backfilled their conference after Texas and Oklahoma left. Brett Yormark, their new commissioner, has not been shy about the fact that he's looking to add teams. He's looking to try and boost the conference as best he can. And so it would stand to reason that you can make that conference better by adding some additional schools out west. The Big 12 is already an interesting conference.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not quite as interesting once Texas and Oklahoma leaves, but it seems like that would make a lot of sense to me for those schools to have a natural landing spot. I don't know what that does for an Oregon State and Washington State.
Right.
It may leave them kind of on the outside looking in, but the Big 12, I think, would continue to build its profile. They just signed a new deal, an extension with, I guess what, Fox and ESPN.
Mm-hmm.
Something like $2.2 billion is the total value of that. And so presumably you get more teams in your conference. You can go back. You can see if you can up that number a little bit. It makes it a better basketball conference, I think, which is not really the topic of our show here, but it's
reasonable. There's money in basketball. There's money in basketball tickets. There's money in the NCAA tournament. There's a crazy number of quality basketball teams in that group of teams.
So I think that makes the Big 12 very interesting. And if you are the commissioner of the Big 12, that's probably something that you're on high alert for, like just ready to bring new teams in.
Yeah, the leftovers, right? It's a conference of people abandoning the conference and then finding a similar situation in other teams from other conferences.
But what's different about this as compared to what we're talking about with USC and UCLA and Oregon and Washington, geographically, Colorado was in the Big 12.
Yeah, correct.
Right? Geographically, this isn't a terrible fit. It makes sense from that standpoint.
Yeah, the Arizona schools recruit that area of the country as well as Southern California, of course. But no, it makes sense from a geographic region. And of course, that the Big 12 can then add later games and get that window with the Arizona schools, who, by the way, already play late at night because of weather the first part of the season anyway. So that's not really a dramatic change there. Chronologically, my assumption is because of the stability of the current Big 12 and how shrewdly they were able to negotiate their new deal and swiftly they were able to negotiate their new deal, that chronologically, my assumption is this is going to play out with the Pac-12 presenting its remaining member schools a deal. Oh, here's $23 million we were able to cobble together with 3 different places, and having the Arizona schools, Utah and Colorado say that's not good enough. It's not good enough for what we think we can get in the Big 12. The Big 12 is now going to formally invite, and we are gone. So that would happen because of the stability, because they have a conference commissioner, because they have been on the record as saying we're going to be aggressive. We are not going to be left behind. That would happen before Oregon and Washington leaving, because there isn't a commissioner atop at the moment with the Big Ten. Now, I'm sure the presidents right now and chancellors or whatever of Big Ten schools know the vague number that they would get if they were to add more schools and what they would offer as unequal shares to Oregon, Washington, or Stanford and Cal, or whoever, should the Big Ten have all of that leverage, even more leverage if the corner schools were to leave. And now we're just talking about a Pac-12 with Bay Area schools, Oregon schools, Washington schools. So that's 6 schools. Am I correct? That's not 6 schools is not a major conference make.
That's a mini pod. That's your mini pod.
That's my mini pod, which is pretty flawed. It's a pretty flawed premise. So what will happen is you get a big Big 12. You get a terrific footprint that spans essentially from West Virginia and Florida on the East Coast to the mountain region to the Pacific region with the Arizona schools. And you're offered a lot of flexibility. And yet, outside of, right now you can only point to TCU because they're the only, if I'm counting this correctly, the only team to make it to the college football playoff from this group of teams. Now, granted, UCF, former national champion. Let's get it clear.
Of course.
But there's no hierarchy. There's no, these are the power schools, which is both a good thing because you like wild open craziness after TCU, I suppose, because they earned that. But also, you like to say, oh, they're top heavy, or they're so deep at the top, or it's just these two teams, right? When we had like Florida State and Clemson duking it out in the ACC, like you like the ability to define the tiers of a conference. And right now, the Big 12 is just a loaded middle, and I appreciate it as somebody who
that
just
makes
likes
it a lot of fun to watch.
It makes it a lot of fun to watch. But it's hard to crack into national conversations if you're just throwing a smattering of 8 and 4 teams at the wall.
No.
So that's the interesting thing. And somebody, it is going to develop, right? It always develops that, okay, now here's the new look of the conference. There's no more Oklahoma. Arizona's up and coming. Oklahoma State has had recent success, but seems to be on a downturn. Houston, but down. Like, you have all these teams that can't sustain. Who is going to be able to finally figure out from this grouping of teams how to sustain? That's fascinating to me. But right now, you can't point to, like, if you were looking at the future iteration of the Big 12, so adding the corner schools, and Utah's been a great team. Utah's been that one team that's been able to sustain. I take it back, but haven't made the playoff. Who to you, what is the matchup of all of these teams where you're in August and you're like, oh, man, this is going to be great, this is going to be great, but it's coming down to this? Is it coming down to the Mountain West matchup of Utah TCU?
It might. Yeah. That was going to be my answer.
Wild. But kind of cool.
It is kind of cool. To the question earlier of what does the addition of Oregon and Washington do to the Big Ten? And I think your point was, well, it makes Washington a better job.
Mm-hmm.
Does the same hold true on the Big 12 side? If you're Jed Fish at Arizona,
right?
Does it make your job? Does it make the Arizona job more attractive to join the Big 16, whatever?
No,
they got to do something about these numbers. The Big 10, the Big 12, the Pac-12. That's already changing, but they're going to have to update these conference names at some point because it's going to get very confusing. But nonetheless, does joining the Big 22 and a half, however many teams,
right,
make Arizona State, make Colorado, make Utah a more prestigious job?
No. The only prestigious jobs in this dystopian future we are outlining are Big 2 jobs. SEC, Big 10. Jed Fish goes 10-2 at Arizona. He's going to be the next coach at Michigan. He's going to be the next coach at Penn State. He's going to be the next coach at Texas. He's going to be the whatever is open, and whatever, whoever wants to ride the Jed Fish train. And so, no. And the same holds true of Sonny Dykes at TCU, even though he took him to the playoff. It's just one of those things where status, exposure, money. Now, you're going to be able to pay Sonny Dykes a good amount of money at TCU, presumably, with this deal. Like, TCU is not a huge, I don't know what their booster situation, I know they don't have a huge alumni base, but if Alabama comes calling, if Tennessee comes calling, if Ohio State comes calling for Sonny Dykes, if he gets them to another playoff and is winning 10 games a year. Now, I know he's from Texas. I know his heart's probably there, and maybe he will stay. Maybe he is that kind of coach. But if somebody doesn't have that specific tie to the school, and there is that big money job and the stability of either going to that big place or knowing that you're going to get a $28 million buyout because of the amount of money that Nebraska or Penn State or Arkansas or any of these schools is able to throw around. I think you got to be gone. I think the Big 12 just is not on that level of security. It's secure in terms of its existence and consistency of existence, but I don't think it means that any of these guys are going to stick around for romantic reasons.
I would be curious to see if we come to the point where the Big 12 now has 16 teams, I think would be the right number. I'd be curious to see, are they still in expansion mode? Are they trying to add more teams?
Right.
Is there a scenario in which suddenly there are teams from the Big 12 that are contenders for either the Big 10 or the SEC? It gets into murky territory, frankly. Very murky territory very, very quickly. And I don't know the answer to that, but it does seem as if this is where we're headed, right? It seems like we're headed towards some schools from the Pac-12 joining the Big 10, the remaining schools from the Pac-12, or some subset of those schools joining the Big 12 as the dog barks because she hates conference realignment.
Right.
And then us trying to figure it out from there. Does that sound about right?
It sounds right. And by the way, on the other point of, is Big 12 status enough to retain a top coach who has interest elsewhere? It's not just in theory, because in practice, Luke Fickell had the opportunity to be a Big 12 coach and opted to be a not Big 12 coach.
That's right.
So, look, that's a sample size of one person, and that one person may have just been through with his tenure at Cincinnati. And the challenge at Wisconsin made a lot of sense. But, somebody's calling me. But he left. It wasn't enough. The allure of being a Big 12 coach in Cincinnati was not enough to keep him there.
Shall we move on?
Sure.
This is the interesting decision point. This is that point in the game where you can either go right or left. And we're going to have to work this out on the fly. We didn't talk about this one beforehand. But so in a world where the Pac-12 is donezo, dead. See Pac-12 on the little animated tombstone from the game.
Right.
And you've got big schools going to the Big 10, other schools going to the Big 12. Suddenly, you've got two other aspects of college football to watch. The first, I think, is the ACC. The first is the ACC because what happens as a result of these teams leaving for greener pastures is you've got all the teams in the ACC, predominantly Florida State, Clemson, maybe even Miami. You can probably lump a bunch of teams. North Carolina is another one, where they're looking at it, the media landscape, and saying, we're really, really falling behind. We're not earning nearly enough to remain competitive with these other schools that are also in FBS.
Right.
So something's got to change. The issue with everybody in the ACC is this grant of rights deal. It is a huge deal. Just to give context, they re-upped this deal in 2016. The deal runs 20 years. Yeah. It does not expire until the academic year 2036, something of that nature. As compared to many of the other deals that we're describing here, it is definitely falling way short. The average value, and teams are getting more than this, okay? But the average value, at least the average listed value, is something like $240 million a year from ESPN to the ACC. Now, what brought this conversation up recently was at a Florida State Board of Trustees meeting that took place last Friday. Our friend Matt Baker from the Tampa Bay Times, or Tampa Times. What I don't even know if I got that right, but
okay, I'll verify.
Our friend Matt Baker, I believe from the Tampa Times, reported that
Tampa Bay Times. You were right. Tampa Bay Times. Yeah,
spoke up at the Board of Trustees meeting and said, "Is the ACC worth it? What would it take to get us out of this ACC deal?" And the number that they came to was something like $120 million for an exit fee. In reality, it would be a lot more. It would be closer to about $350 million. The slide deck that they had listed out Florida State getting about $17 million a year from this deal. That is also not accurate. It's closer to $35, $40 million a year. So they're not exactly on the cheap with this thing. But if we're talking about a world in which Texas and Oklahoma go to the SEC and get $100 million a year, they're getting lapped pretty good.
Right.
They're getting lapped. So this brings us to a scenario in which we've got these schools in the ACC.
Was it really 300 million? I thought I'd heard 120. Maybe it was two schools together would be 300?
The total package for a school like a Florida State, if you include all of the penalties that they would have to pay.
I didn't see that number. Okay.
Not just the numbers that were cited as part of that conversation, but the total package to get out of it would be like $350 million, which is a little cost prohibitive.
Yep.
Okay. That's not a Jimbo Fisher buyout. That's a lot of freaking money. You've got schools now looking at their deal, probably hoping they can get out of that 20-year pact, which is, again, going to run through 2036. You've also got Notre Dame kind of on the periphery as well.
Right, as a pseudo member of the ACC, yeah.
A pseudo member of the ACC, but also playing the field in a sense.
Sure.
Notre Dame is independent. They're proudly independent. Their deal, their listed deal, again, with NBC is something like $150 million over 10 years. That expires in 2025, which is probably another key date to watch here. They are clearly falling short of many of these other numbers, although I think for Notre Dame, it's not truly just about the money, as it might be for some other places. Where I'm going with this is, what is the next shoe to fall? What is the next shoe to fall? Is it Notre Dame deciding at this point, okay, schools are bundling up, we are being left behind if we don't?
Right.
Or is it some sort of coup d'etat in the ACC where you've got schools getting together, finding a way to bring a lawsuit against their deal with ESPN and getting their way out of it? What is the next thing to happen?
Wait, so you're going to have Florida State sue ESPN and then try to become a member of the ESPN SEC conference?
I don't know. But, Brett said it on the show that we did.
Yeah.
Right? Brett said that until a team can figure out a way to climb over or tunnel under the grant of rights deal that they currently have with ESPN, they're probably going to stand pat. I'm asking, is there some way to tunnel under to climb over that deal that kind of extends beyond the realm of what we're comfortable talking about, like lawsuits? I believe there's a clause in that grant of rights where if suddenly the value of the deal is harmed for one reason or another, maybe a school leaving, or maybe just by virtue of the other rights around college football becoming so inflated that they feel left behind. I'm not a lawyer. I don't claim to be one on this podcast, but there is probably an argument to be made in that arena that could maybe give them another avenue to get out of this thing.
Yeah, it's weird. Florida State and Clemson, Miami, whoever you consider to be the big fish, North Carolina, of course, because of their sometimes dual sport ability, great academics. I know Virginia has been in these conversations as like a fit for the Big Ten, as is North Carolina, right? That you're extending geographically, you're adding to basketball, you're adding presumably sometimes to football, and reputationally, these are terrific academic places. I don't know what leverage any of these places have, because right now ESPN has them completely tied up, right? ESPN loves the fact that they're not paying them that much money, and they get to pay them not that much money for a long time. So you'd have to provide some sort of incentive. You'd have to join an ESPN property conference, which would be the SEC if you're Florida State, which is the only conference that would make sense for Florida State. It seems geographically, that's the fit. You would have to take such a crazy reduced share to join the SEC. And even still, what ESPN has such a golden goose right now with the SEC that, like, why do they care? What does Florida State make the SEC into that it's not right now? They already have the University of Florida. They already have the University of Georgia right there geographically. ESPN's in an unbelievable position of leverage to say, I don't know, we're just going to keep paying you $17 million a year. That sounds good to us. I don't know what lawsuit can come about. It would have to be Florida State providing some sort of crazy incentive. I just can't think of it. Unless lawyers for Florida State, lawyers for Miami, whoever else are able to concoct some sort of strategy. But no, I think the ACC is eventually going to break apart, but is it going to be 2029 with lawsuits and with some sort of deal, some sort of buyout deal or at a reduced, everybody's going to agree to pay $80 million instead of $300 million, whatever number you cited? Maybe. Yeah. But what's going to happen is the ACC bundled, and what happens with bundles? They tend to unbundle over time. And so the ACC is basically, I don't know who's left standing. If what Brett said comes to pass, that we're going to deal with two 24-team conferences in the Big Ten and the SEC, like who is left behind? Is it just, the Big East exists again? Welcome back, Pitt. Like, is it going to be Pitt, Syracuse, and Boston College? Like, you could see a universe in which Georgia Tech goes to the SEC. Geographically, it makes sense. You can see a universe in which North Carolina ends up in the Big Ten, Virginia ends up in the Big Ten. So now we're dealing with former Big East team Virginia Tech. You're dealing with Wake. Is NC State going to find a home? Like, what does Louisville make sense for the SEC geographically? But do they add much in terms of a huge audience and academics and status that, we got Louisville? I don't know. I don't honestly know. So it feels like we are reforming Big East football at some point in the next decade or decade and a half.
I think it's totally on the table. Let's be clear about this. I think with the ACC, I think the only way, and again, I'm prefacing this by saying I'm not a lawyer. I probably don't know what I'm talking about. I know.
Hold on. Let me offer this right now. You and I definitely don't know what we're talking about.
No, we have no idea what we're talking. But so here's the thing. Because the grant of rights makes it so difficult financially to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
The only way I think this is going to go down is if they all band together and figure out some way as a collective entity to overthrow whatever agreement they're in. I don't know what that entails, but that seems like the thing that would make the most sense as opposed to Florida State, Clemson laying down, $300 some odd million. That's insane to me. That's insane. And I don't think that would be an easy sell for a board of trustees, right? So to that end, I think you're looking at an ACC with its 14 teams right now and a weird world in which there is competition between the Big Ten and the SEC to try and get some of these schools. Right. Suddenly, if we're talking about a Big Two universe, if we're talking about the SEC getting Georgia Tech, the SEC getting North Carolina versus the Big Ten, you can envision a world in which there is suddenly a lot of conflict between those two big entities trying to land these schools. You can envision a world in which the Big 12, if it wants to remain very aggressive, saying, okay, well, we've already got West Virginia. What about Pitt? We've already got West Virginia. What about extending our footprint farther to the east and getting a Boston College or even a Louisville, right? Whoa. Suddenly there's a lot of competition for some of these teams that on the surface aren't necessarily favorites for one conference over the other. Right. I think we know for sure that North Carolina would have its pick of the litter. We know that probably a school like a Florida State, a Clemson, even a Louisville, right? These schools could go pretty much wherever they wanted for a variety of reasons. These are bigger programs. But if you're a Boston College, if you're a Wake Forest, if you're...
Duke is interesting because of academics and basketball, yeah.
Yeah, but even like a Virginia Tech, right? If you're those schools that I hesitate to say like on the fringes of this whole conversation, it may not be the type of deal that you get the like pick of the litter with respect to conference, but you probably have options.
Sure. I think a lot of these places now, the Northeast schools are interesting to me. I think they're going to have fewer. Like, is Pitt going to join the Big 12? Oh, probably if that's their only option. Sure. It becomes a very strange landscape that
I had heard way back when at the start of this whole Big Ten thing. So way back when, in this case being a year ago.
Yeah.
When I had talked to a few people that aren't necessarily connected, but know the landscape better than me. When I asked about Pitt, I was told emphatically no way in hell in the Big Ten. Now, things change quickly.
Because of Penn State?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
But that was the word on the street.
Okay.
As of about a year ago. Now, who knows where we'll be a year from today and how things could change if the Big Ten does add additional schools in Oregon and Washington and that sort of thing. But it would seem to me that Pitt would make sense in either a reformulated Big East or perhaps a Big 18 now.
Man, yeah, I didn't consider Pitt in the Big Ten. It just didn't seem to work for me. I don't know why. Pittsburgh's right on the border of Ohio. Pennsylvania is at least sort of half or a third of Pennsylvania. You can speak to this better than I can. Very Midwestern, right? Like it culturally does feel like it fits. Obviously, Penn State is in Central PA, and it works. No, I think they would be one of those teams that would be searching and that conferences would have leverage over.
Yeah.
And
You've got some teams on the periphery, right? I put Virginia Tech in there. I don't think Virginia and Virginia Tech would go to different conferences. I think whichever conference gets one gets the other.
You think
Virginia,
that? I think the Big Ten, if the Big Ten called Virginia in an hour and said, we'll take you but not Tech, they'd be like, all right, cool, let's do it.
I think we'll be so far down the food chain at this point that whoever gets one gets both.
I don't know. Okay, fair. I mean, Oregon doesn't care about Oregon State in this scenario, right?
No.
They've got their partner in Washington, though, which they also have their rivalry, and it makes geographic sense. And they're not close, by the way. I think Virginia Tech are something like 2.5, 3 hours away from each other.
That's a pretty good haul. Yeah, Charlottesville is a pretty good haul from Blacksburg.
Yeah, I don't know the difference between the Eugene to Seattle and Blacksburg and Charlottesville, but I think it's not crazy different.
Even schools like Georgia Tech's a really interesting case. Because if there is a world in which you've got conferences competing for teams, I think North Carolina is one that definitely rises to that level. Florida State, for sure, I think is going SEC. As soon as they can, they're gone. Clemson probably as well. But North Carolina and Georgia Tech, to me, seem like they could be schools that are very sought after by both the Big Ten and SEC. Obviously, the Georgia Tech situation is they're in Georgia. Their biggest in-state rival is the Georgia Bull, two-time defending champion Georgia Bulldogs. It'd make a lot of sense for them to just stay put and keep things, in the Southeast, contained in the Southeast. But there were recent rumors that the Big Ten was sniffing around the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets as well.
It makes sense. It absolutely makes sense to extend south and get that footprint and big city and academic. It obviously feels like a fit. My question to you is, in 2037, after Fox and Disney kill college football, are we a baseball show? Are we going all in on college tennis to like 11 listeners? Are we,
all
sci-fi
UFOs.
Movies?
We're just going UFOs by that
all
point.
Interesting. Interesting. I mean, right now would be the time, right?
now would be high times to do the UFO thing.
Pivot. Isn't that Ross from Friends? Am I getting my reference correct?
I think so.
Yeah, it does feel very dystopian and very sad, all of this. Let me ask you this. Can I go full oval, circle, trapezoid, whatever? Oregon State and Washington State are the clear teams who would be left behind in all of these dominoes falling, right? The Big Ten continuing to grow, the Big 12 continuing to grow, the ACC and the lock it has on its teams. So let's say we're now talking about a world in which it's a big win for the Mountain West. They add, by their standards, significantly bigger programs in Oregon State and Washington State, adding to, if this is a world in which the Pac-12 dissolves, so then San Diego State is still in the Mountain West, and you have Boise State and Colorado State, and so you have a pretty sizable footprint within the Mountain and West region, as the Mountain West is. What does the future of Oregon State and Washington State football look like? What does the future of Mountain West football look like? They can't compete with the Big 12 still in terms, or probably even, we'll see what they can compete with the American, of course. But what does this look like in terms of how we categorize conferences? And if all of a sudden Oregon State and Washington State are going from 20-ish million, 19 million, 16 million down to like 7 million, 9 million.
That's a problem.
That's a huge problem for all of their sports, all of their exposure, all of their ability to retain. I mean, they've already had difficulties. Well, Washington State did a good job retaining Mike Leach for a long time, and Oregon State did a good job with Mike Riley, but he's homegrown. What does that do to two programs who have, in large part, I think, fought above their weight class. They've won a lot of games. They've been to a lot of bowl games. They've beaten a lot of top-tier teams. What does that mean for the future of those programs?
Well, I think it means maybe in the future DJU isn't transferring there.
Yeah.
I think it means that if you've got a promising coach, that it's even more of a stepping stone.
Mm-hmm.
I think it means that you are even more susceptible to the transfer portal than maybe you currently are.
Way harder to raise money.
Harder to raise money.
Way harder to raise money. It's saying like, look, we need a little bit more money to keep up with so-and-so. And all of a sudden you are used to being the small fish in a medium-sized pond, and now you are a large fish in a smaller pond.
In a smaller pond. There is also a separate conversation that I think needs to take place, and we're not going to do it on today's episode, but maybe we'll invite Matt Brown back on at some point to talk about it in more detail. There is a conversation as the rules of college football continue to evolve and the role of a quote-unquote student athlete continues to evolve.
Oh, of course.
There is a world in the not-too-distant future where schools now have to pay quote-unquote employees of their football team. And if we get there, some people think we are headed there one way or the other.
Sure, of course.
If that happens, a school like a Florida State joining a big money SEC is much better positioned to take that type of cost than a school like a Washington State.
Yeah.
You know, Washington State that gets its income cut in half and still has to try and field a competitive team. Maybe that creates the natural break that we've talked about between the quote unquote Power 5 or whatever it is, Power 3 at that point, and the have-nots.
I could also see, continue.
I was just going to say, it definitely puts those types of schools at a grave disadvantage.
This all, again, if these specific dominoes come to pass, I think there is a non-zero chance we're talking about the end of Stanford and Cal football. Like, these are...
If they don't join the Big Ten.
If they don't join the Big Ten. That's what I'm talking about. If they don't join the Big Ten, Stanford and Cal, the football culture essentially doesn't exist. Outside of Marshawn Lynch driving a cart after Cal beat Washington, there are Cal football superfans. I'm positive. There are Stanford football superfans. I'm positive. Are there more than 73? I'm not positive.
Yeah.
So football seems to exist at those places now as a great, fun bonus. Now, they've both tried to upgrade facilities. Stanford a few years ago upgraded or sort of fixed up and remodeled their stadium. It's a cool stadium. I've been there. They did a good job. They're just not buzz-generating places. Stanford at least has had success and been to Rose Bowls, won Rose Bowls, had, top flight players go on to the NFL, and guys like Andrew Luck and Christian McCaffrey. It's been a slog, though. For these past few years, for both of these programs, it's been a slog. Stanford starting over at coach. Cal has not. I mean, Justin Wilcox doesn't seem like he's the long-term answer at head coach at Cal. We'll see. But those are schools that have uphill battles in terms of getting people excited about football and getting people in their specific region to care en masse about watching their games on TV. So, yeah, if Stanford and Cal are presented the option, they don't get the Big Ten invite, at least not right away, and they're presented the option of joining the Mountain West for their survival. Or maybe the Big 12 wants them. I don't know, but I don't think they're a fit with the Big 12. Mountain West, or just take that money elsewhere. I don't know if we're seeing Stanford and Cal football. I don't know.
That brings us then to Notre Dame.
Yep.
I believe the first domino to fall of the remaining schools as we're talking through. I believe the next domino to fall will be Florida State. I think they will find some way out of that arrangement sooner than later. And I don't know how they're going to do it.
Okay.
It might require a little bit of pixie dust and Ben Matlock, and I don't know how you do it, but
the Saudis. I think the Saudis are going to.
Saudis.
If there's any school.
Yeah. Maybe. I don't know, but I just, the stakes are too high and they value their football program too much to feel like they're in a position where they're left behind. That being said, the existing deal with Notre Dame expires in 2025. Notre Dame is, as Brett mentioned on the last episode, is not necessarily compelled to join a conference. I think they will when they have to, but as he said, as long as they're being paid a decent sum, as long as they still have access to the playoff, it's actually a pretty favorable arrangement for them. They don't have to play that conference championship game. In effect, with the way that they've set up the 12-team playoff, their conference championship game would be their round one game against whoever. So it's not a bad setup for Notre Dame. I do think, though, at some point, they will be compelled to join a conference. At some point, they will have no choice other than to join the Big Ten. The Big Ten, you have to imagine, has a standing invite for Notre Dame. Frankly, the SEC might as well. I think anybody would want Notre Dame and the value that they, if this is a money sport now, then Notre Dame is a whale. They bring a ton of value. I would not want to see Notre Dame in the SEC. I think that would be a problem for Notre Dame's prospects to compete. But maybe that's a compelling offer. I don't know. The Big Ten makes so much sense. It always has. It has bothered me to no end that they haven't considered it.
I think we have enough good authority that they are considering all options.
I'm sure that Jack Swarbrick has considered what his next move is here.
Yeah.
If the college football earth beneath him crumbles and he has to go looking for a home, the Big Ten would probably be the one that makes the most sense. It just bothers me that it's gotten to this point. Like, I feel like they should have done it a long time ago. That's just me speaking as a fan. Nonetheless, I think Notre Dame is probably the last one to join.
What do you think the sticking points are with Notre Dame and the Big Ten? Now, aside from the obvious, we value our independence, our culture. It's a culture of independence. This is our tradition. Our tradition is that we are not adhering fully to conference membership.
Yeah.
What do you think when the Big Ten says, look, we'll give you the full share, $70 million, whatever, $80 million? What do you think the sticking points are with Notre Dame as it relates to the Big Ten? Because it makes sense for all of their sports. They're already in a state with two Big Ten schools. They already have existing pseudo rivalries, at least, with the Michigan schools. They've played big games against Ohio State. They have a current home and home with Ohio State. Yep. They've played big games, not as often, but they've played big games against a number of other schools within the Big Ten. There's scar tissue there. It makes all the sense in the world from a familiarity standpoint. Is it the number of home games? Is it the number of overall games? It's Notre Dame, because obviously the USC rivalry would be fortified with USC now coming into the Big Ten. What is the Notre Dame ask that is too much for is Notre Dame asking for more money than everybody else?
I don't know if it's so much Notre Dame asking for anything as them having to forfeit independence. And that might sound goofy. I get it, but as Brett said on the last episode, as I've been saying for years now, we had Pete Sampson on this show. He's talked about it time and again. The independence thing really is a big deal for Notre Dame people. It really is a big deal. That ability to schedule who you want, when you want, to kind of operate as your own little fiefdom in the world of college football, to do things your way when everyone else has to answer to a conference. They value that. They put really high value on that.
Do you think Notre Dame's asking for an ACC deal from the Big Ten then?
Where they can be kind of like a full-time member whenever they want to be?
Right. Where they're saying, look, we want to be Big Ten-ish, right? We want 5 games a year, right? And then we want to still be able to schedule Boston College and Navy and a random American team. Like, do you think Notre Dame is asking for that sort of sweetheart thing? And the Big Ten's like, look, no, absolutely not. Like, do you think it's haggling over number of games that like the rest of the conference is going to play 9 conference games and Notre Dame's like, we'll give you 6?
Yeah. I mean, look, let's put it this way. I think, as I just said, the biggest sticking point is probably the independence.
Right.
And
well, so that's what I'm saying. That's the independence.
If there is a conversation about how much of that independence they're able to retain, that would not surprise me.
Right.
I don't know to what extent Notre Dame's even talked about being in a conference, right? I have to imagine they've been approached.
Right.
We've read the reports, so for sure it's not like Jack Swarbrick is staring out at the landscape wondering what's going on. Jack Swarbrick, I have to believe, is pretty involved in this whole process, this conversation. And my hunch is that they want to try and retain as much independence as they can. It is a school that prides itself on being able to operate kind of independently and have that mindset. Part of it might be the conference giving them that leeway to sell to their fan base that they're still maintaining some modicum of independence despite the fact that they become, in effect, a full member of the Big Ten. It's a fascinating conversation, and there will be a point at which I think the emotional connection, let's say, to being independent has to go out the window. If we start talking about $100 million versus $25 million a year,
right,
whatever that number is going to be, on some level, it's great to be nostalgic for the past and what once was, being able to schedule whoever, whenever, and operate kind of as their own little thing. But this is about money now.
Well, it's also
about money.
Okay, so Notre Dame has money. Notre Dame has money in its coffers, but it also has a lot of, and this is where I'm not sure Florida State has. This is where I'm not sure where Florida State falls in, because, and I think Florida State has improved their facilities and they will continue to. But remember, if you remember the Jimbo Fisher thing, there was the sticking point of not having a football only facility. That was a source of frustration that it was promised, but it's in, whatever. That's water under the bridge at this point. But does Florida State have those three donors who are saying, yeah, we'll put in $80 million each to get to the SEC?
There's no way.
Right. So this is just a guess. It's just a guess that right now Florida State doesn't have that kind of, they're not swinging around that kind of wallet. Notre Dame, on the other hand, from what I can tell, has a lot of money behind it. And so when you say 25 million versus 100 million, you're also saying, well, look, Booster Larry, Booster Steve, Booster Deborah, we're not going to join if you don't want us to join, but we're going to need help from you defraying some of the difference, right? If you feel so passionately about throwing your money into an independent school, fine, but just know that these are the dollars and cents right now, because those are the ones that are ultimately making that decision.
There is another scenario, if we're playing hypotheticals, that we should at least explore.
Sure.
And that is the ACC somehow offering a sweetheart deal to Notre Dame.
Okay.
The ACC recognizing that it is in a moment of peril here, that there is an existential crisis, maybe not in the immediate future, but if things go south in the Pac-12, the ACC has to know what's next. It's the next focal point.
But what does the ACC have to offer Notre Dame?
I don't know. I mean, it sounds to me like you're going to have schools like Florida State, like Clemson. I'm not sure who else. Try to find some sort of try to renegotiate, try to find some sort of way to get uneven shares to be paid what they're quote unquote worth. And in a world like that, you could very easily envision the ACC going to Notre Dame and saying, we'll give you an uneven share if you join the conference. Joining the conference makes all of us more valuable. It allows us to coexist with the quote unquote big two.
Right.
Is this something you're interested in? I don't think Notre Dame takes that deal. I don't think there's any chance in hell they take that deal.
There's no universe in which Notre Dame joins any conference other than the Big Ten to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I could at least see that conversation being something that Dennis Dodd reports on in the year 2025.
Yeah, I'm positive that all of the Notre Dame conversations that happened in a back room of a steakhouse that is so fancy that I wouldn't even know how to walk in the door.
We talking about like a Shula's Steakhouse?
A Shula's, a Michael Jordan's, a Mickey Mantle's.
Yeah.
That conversation, to me, if I'm guessing, totally guessing, is not a money thing because the money's obvious. Of course, you're only going for a crap ton of money. To me, it is an independence thing which was then Kevin Warren, which now will be whoever, and Jack Swarbrick or whoever, whatever president, chancellor, anything from Notre Dame, whoever's in that room making those decisions, passing a piece of paper back and forth that says five games. And then the paper that comes back says 7 games. And then the paper that comes back says 4 games. Then the paper that back says 8 games. Like that to me is going to be the start of any relationship between Notre Dame and one of the big two, specifically the Big Ten. I don't think the ACC has anything to offer because look, ESPN getting Notre Dame in the ACC, sure, that's a win. ESPN loves the deal they have with the ACC.
They love it. It's a bargain, right?
They love it.
It's a bargain.
And
it was a bargain when they signed a 20-year deal.
Yeah.
2016 was not all that long ago.
No.
Where but perhaps it lacked the foresight.
How does Clemson and Florida State in the SEC strike you? What is your initial thought about an SEC that includes the Noles and the Tigers?
Florida State, I think, makes a ton of sense. It makes a ton of sense. Clemson, at least from a cultural standpoint, seems like it makes sense. These are schools that, for all intents and purposes, operate like SEC programs anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So that wouldn't be a weird fit to me at all. It seems like that makes a lot of sense. I think the limitation for me is that I tend to think of these programs geographically and where it makes sense for them to go next.
Mm-hmm.
And we are clearly living in a world that does not matter.
No.
Right. USC, UCLA, perhaps Oregon and Washington in the Big Ten. That doesn't make any sense to a 30-year-old Ty, right?
Mm-hmm.
But here we are. So I tend to think of it in terms of that makes the most sense. Obviously, you've got one Florida school already in the SEC, adding a Miami, adding a Florida State. It just seems like you own the state of Florida, talent-rich Florida, right? You own that, and that's part of the SEC. Now, you've annexed it for the SEC, outside of UCF, of course. But it strikes me as something that makes a lot of sense, and probably as something that both of those schools very much desire. I think it's SEC or bust for both of them.
What's interesting to me is Florida State as an independent all those years ago, Big East team, ACC team, they've always been sort of the big fish. They've been that koi in the goldfish bowl. Clemson has ascended to that as Florida State has gone downhill, and you get threats. You get the loss to Pitt. You get a loss to Syracuse here. You get the, Sam Howell at the last second. They came up just short. You get those kind of scares. But Clemson ascended to this big dog in a conference full of medium-sized dogs. I'm using fish and dogs. I'm really mixing my metaphors up here, Ty, and I apologize for that.
Yeah.
I think Clemson just gets totally lost in the shuffle in the SEC. I don't think there's anything unique about Dabo and Clemson in the SEC. I don't know how they would peacock and stand out at all. There's already a team in that state in the SEC, so that's not adding novelty, even though they've been much better than South Carolina until this past year. I think they get totally lost. I think there becomes a lot less special about Clemson, which already has a difficult time selling itself as a national power. Even with the national championships, Clemson football has not moved the needle. People are not watching Clemson in droves across the country. It is not something that has revolutionized anything in the way that like college football fandom exists. It's been an unbelievably successful program and a great story for a lot of these guys. But Clemson in the SEC, and all of a sudden they have a schedule full of teams that have much bigger fan bases and have won much more historically and just bring a lot more national cachet to the table. Are you much more likely to watch Florida Clemson than you are Florida Tennessee? No. Are you like, I don't see in terms of juice what Clemson actually brings to the table. And I just think they become another team after leaving a conference in which they are the team.
What happens next then? In our goofy little Oregon Trail game here, I'll play this again.
Please.
To close things out, we've now got a world in which the ACC is dead. Notre Dame's joined the Big Ten. We've got a Big Ten, an SEC, a Big 12 with a lot of high-quality spare parts, let's say. A Mountain West that's been a bit reinforced. The MAC, which, as Brett said, is like cockroaches on Armageddon. It will forever remain self-contained. You've got other conferences here.
You got the American losing quality teams, though.
The American loses quality teams. The Sun Belt is probably still the Fun Belt.
Yeah, of course.
So it's not like we're void of teams beyond those top two conferences, but we are clearly in a world in which we've got Big Ten, the SEC, the high-quality spare FBS parts in the Big 12, and then everybody else. Is there a next thing that happens? Are we waiting for the Big Bang where everybody decouples? What happens next?
Well, you'll have Power 4 with Big 12, SEC, ACC, Big 10. In this scenario, you'll have a Power 4.
No, in this scenario, the ACC's dead.
Oh, in this scenario, the ACC's dead and picked apart.
picked apart, man.
So you have a
picked
big
apart.
3-ish because the Big
Big
12 will
2.5?
add somebody. No, I think for the purposes of this, the Big 2 are going to get all of the attention, but I still think you're going to get, some sort of automatic playoff consideration for the Big 12, considering the number of quality programs there. I think it stands out from its competition beneath the Big 2, to be clear. Yeah, I think you're going to see teams decide that football at a certain price point, especially when you mention players becoming employees and there needing to be salaries and insurance and tax considerations. I think they're going to see programs say, like, we can't fill a stadium and it's not worth it to us. We can't operate with making, $2.5 million, $5 million, $8 million. We can't compete. And then the amount of coaching turnover, the amount of player turnover with how easy it is currently to move around the sport, I think you're just going to see programs that if they're not breaking even, at the very least, if they're not breaking even over time, they're going to drop a level or they're just going to abandon the sport. That's been the history of the sport, by the way.
Yeah, that has.
So
very much.
I just think it's going to be cyclical in its nature, just in a new way.
Well, look, you and I talked a lot this episode.
That's what we do.
We want to hear from, not my dog, who again is barking.
That's okay.
But we want to hear from the Verballerhood. Solidverbal@gmail.com, as always, is the email address. Don't forget, you can also go on out to our Patreon at verballers.com if you want to take part in our community, be part of our Discord. Let us know there what you think about the next moves in college football. You can also find us all across social media, Twitter, Facebook. We're doing a lot more on YouTube. We're posting videos out there pretty much every day. So go on out, find our YouTube channel. Make sure you hit subscribe and smash the like button, as the kids say, as we're trying hard to grow that as quickly as we can, Dan. This is a hot button issue. We debated whether or not we wanted to build the entire plane out of it this week, but I feel like we have no choice. It's the thing that people are searching for and talking about, and obviously have hot takes and opinions on. Yeah. This is not going to change in the immediate future. What I would say, as we kind of zoom back in here on where things stand at the moment, it's going to get real interesting over the next 6 weeks.
Yeah.
The next 6 weeks, I think, are crucial with respect to where this story goes next. So even if you're not interested in the whole galaxy brain thing that Dan and I laid out here today, the next month and a half or so, getting into April after the NCAA tournament, that time period will be a very, very tender time, especially for the Pac-12 as they try to hash out these media rights. Pay very close attention to that. I've been writing about it every week in the newsletter, which I guess I didn't mention at the top of the show, which you can go to our website and sign up for. I want to stop writing about it. I really, truly do, because I feel like it bums people out. It bums me out to write about it. But that's just where we're at. That's the news of the day. So more to come, right? Yeah, we're going to send each other pagers. So anytime the news breaks, we're ready to roll. We're going to wear them on our belts like the cool grown-ups that we are. Maybe we'll install some sirens in our homes. And we're like, all right, well, corner schools are gone. What does it mean? That's right. That's right. That's all I have, Ty. For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein. For myself, Ty Hildebrand, thanks so much for downloading, for listening, for playing along at home. Don't forget to go on out to verballers.com. We've got a bonus Brunei episode. Ooh. Come and listen. Come and ask questions. Talk to y'all soon. Stay solid. Peace.